Good morning, everyone. Can you close the door, please? Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the last day of our RCM meeting. As I guess some of you may be first day for you to attend. So this is the meeting for NSF-funded Research Coordination Network on Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage. And last 2 days, we've been having a lot of discussions on what are the current challenges and what we should work on and what are the right questions on CCUS. First day, we started with excellent workshop on how to do CO2 capture from air and how to convert them into useful products. And yesterday, we had 2 sessions on first talking about regulatory development, cost and risk assessment. And second half of the day, we talked about what are the large-scale demonstration projects we worked on and what we learned, what went wrong, but what also went right. And then can we really do this in the large scale in the future? So today, we're going to have a third session, which is the last one. This is a panel discussion on current status and challenges in CO2 capture and conversion. And a lot of discussions will be spent around the chemistry and reactions and reactor designs on how to do this in a smart way. And I hope that not only looking into, based on looking at these panelists, some of them are actually involved in spin-off companies, and they are really thinking about not only the chemistry of the reactions, but also thinking about how this whole CO2 capture and conversion fits into overall scheme so that we can actually achieve sustainable pathways to capture and convert CO2. So today, I guess we didn't really, we kind of forgot that some of you are really new to carbon capture and storage. So I'm going to give brief introduction on what is CO2 capture means, what we've done in the past, and what we are working on at this point. As Klaus mentioned a number of times that at Lemfest Center for Sustainable Energy at Columbia University, we've been working on various aspects of how to provide cheap and inexpensive power or energy for people and without having environmental impacts. And 3 major players we've been thinking about was nuclear, solar, and fossil. And as you know that in the past, we were looking at fossil fuel, mostly coal. Now we are looking at natural gas quite a bit. But we are basically skimming energy from it by just burning it and try to turn that into heat or electricity. It was so cheap to have coal so that we really didn't care, or, well, it didn't need to be, we have to extract energy as much as possible. But now as coal price increases, and there are other stuff in coal, right? Sulfur, mercury, and all that so on. As you add environmental control units to power plants, each time you're eating off your own capacity, which is already low enough. So our power plant efficiency at this point is 34, 36% around there in the United States, and our power plants are quite old. Compared to some of the Asian countries, they have a better power plant, somewhat better, so as high as 45% efficiency. That's at least better than us. They have a little more wiggle room to work with. But when we're talking about 34% efficiency, and if we're going to eat off 1/3 of that by doing CO2 capture, this is a big problem. And that's why we discussed, is retrofit even a possibility? So instead of doing just single step to electricity and heat, I think a lot of people worked on many years, right, for a few decades, that maybe we can go through different pathways, and then you can even make these energy carriers not only making electricity. And all these are possible. And depending on how you do it, carbon footprint will be quite different. For example, if you compare jet fuel from petroleum-based versus you can gasify coal and make a jet fuel. And South Africa done it many years, very great way. And economically some point as well. But when you look at the carbon footprint of those two, in fact, I think one of the slides showed in the last 2 days that carbon footprint of the synthetic fuel is like double the amount compared to the one based on petroleum-based. So if you're not really looking at the overall scheme, you think you're doing something good for the environment, but maybe not, right? So that when you develop a new reaction schemes or reaction pathways or new technology, you really need to think about why did we start this at the first place, and are we moving towards that goal? I think that's very important. So one of the areas we are particularly working on is, can you capture CO2 along the way and store Or, like a lot of our colleagues going to talk about today, is that can we actually put it back into the circulation and recycle back? And by doing so, of course, you can only do that with carbon-free energy. No point using burning another coal to recycle CO2. But if we one day, well, hopefully we're moving as fast as we can to the renewable energy cheap enough for us to manipulate carbon as much as possible. So there are many different carbon capture technologies being developed in the past, and we had a lot of discussion on diffuse sources like air. We can definitely capture CO2 from there. And I think most of the technology we've been developing was mostly for concentrated sources, especially power plant. Just because it's well-defined, it's already there, and it's assumed to be a lot easier. But when you look at all these chemistries or technologies, you can use these quite a bit into air capture as well. And I think that was the whole reason we had that workshop, so that let's share the notes, and can we actually have good synergy between CO2 capture from concentrated sources as well as diffuse sources. In the concentrated sources, what people have been working on is physical and chemical absorption and cryogenic separation. We're going to talk about a little bit on that. And a lot of reaction-based solvent injection. And oxy-fuel combustion, which is going with the cryogenic separation, they're basically feeding oxygen into boiler instead of having air, which has a lot of nitrogen. So basically, you don't need to do CO2 separation because you'll be end up with only CO2, mostly CO2. There are other ones which I'm particularly interested, which is integrated carbon capture technologies, and some of the speakers will also talk about that, which means that not only we do CO2 capture, which is high energy proposition, you can actually combine it with maybe hydrogen production and many other processes so that you can achieve the overall sustainability improved at the end of the day. So this is some of the pictures. Klaus can tell me, are these old pictures? I guess some of the very old pictures. But this is kind of how it started. But chemistry-wise, it's not so much different from concentrated CO2 capture because they are still using amine-based material. But the unique part of this material is doing humidity swing compared to a lot of concentrated CO2 capture units are using either temperature or pressure swings. But I think at the end of the day, they have a variety of these shapes and materials because they want to increase high surface area, high amine loading, and see whether they can do it. In the concentrated part, which we've been more focusing on, and DOE goal, U.S. Department of Energy always says in the power plant, if you should capture over 90% of CO2 with less than 35% increase in cost of electricity. So there are many different goals we are given. This is the map, 2010. I guess they update every year, but then it doesn't change as much. This is the ready for demonstration versus the cost reduction benefit for various technologies at this point. And I guess that one of the speakers is going to talk about chemical looping, and DOE thinks that it's more futuristic technologies. But in fact, I think Alice can tell me that it's not right here. It might be closer to this side at this point. There are technologies, amine-based solvent. We have large-scale demonstrations people talked about. And we do also have membrane technologies and also cryogenic oxygen right here. So these technologies, amine-based or cryogenic, just cooling the air down to get oxygen and then feed the oxygen into boiler, or using amine, weak base, to capture CO2 chemical way, we kind of know chemistry quite well. But how to apply these and what kind of amine you want is a big question. So one of the most well-known or widely accepted or practiced CO2 capture technologies, monoethanolamine. ME technologies, we've been studying this for many years, and you know the Gerrard Shelley at UT Austin is one of the leading experts and who've been working on this area for a long time. Kinetic of how fast this material can pick up CO2 is very rapid. So you can start with this CO2 capture unit at about 40 to 60 degrees C. And amine is a solvent, means it's a liquid. It's like water. And usually because it's highly corrosive and many other limitations, it can be used only maximum 30 weight% in water. So it's kind of diluted in water. And then that solvent will go into this reactor and capture CO2 from about 12 to 15 volume% in flue gas. Kinetic is very fast, and once you capture it, Of course, you have to put it into second reactor to regenerate because you do not want a fresh solvent or use fresh solvent to capture CO2 each time. Then the amount of solvent you need is tremendous. It's never going to be economical. So what people do is you capture CO2 and release, and you go back and forth. And in order to break that chemical bond amine made with CO2, you have to add energy. You can do it in terms of pressure. You can do it in terms of temperature. Most of people do it with temperature, so that temperature in the second unit is about 120 to 140 degrees C at least. So by doing so, you can go back and forth. This technology works really well and then does capture CO2 quite well. The biggest challenge people realized after doing all the energy balance and energy calculation was that the energy consumption in the first reactor is not so much, but more energy consumption in the second reactor. So what people realized was water is not a really good solvent for CO2, but it's going along the ride. And then heating it up a large amount of water and cooling it down a large amount of water takes a lot of energy. So that people are getting frustrated that, well, this works really well, but there's all that water going along the ride. So that unless we do really smart heat integration, you can't really reduce the parasitic energy consumption. So that's where you are. So it does not mean we should not working on MEA. We should. And this is, if we have to do CO2 capture tomorrow, more likely we'll do MEA or something like chilled ammonia. But at the same time, there are challenges. So based on that challenges, people said, well, we do like amine, but we don't like that water. So I guess usually people like to go extreme the end, right? So they got rid of all the water, ended up with solid solvent, so that now we have a solid solvent loaded with amine functional groups. So similar chemistry with amine reacting with CO2, but now there's no water. But now instead of water, we have inorganic support, right? So moving all that support around high temperature and low temperature and all that, that's not that easy either, but this is another challenge and another opportunity, I guess. So in order to minimize the solid circulation throughout the system, so that this technology, this is the picture at the top, molecular basket solvent by Professor Song at Penn State, and this is one of the example of a material which is hollow, is a hollow in the center, and then mesoporous shell structure. I worked with Emmanuel Ginetis at Cornell University. So how to make it light and fluffy so that it has less weight for us to carry, and how can we have a highest surface area to load the amine on? And that's what people have been working on. So most of the challenges in this area has been how to make the solvent support, amine support, has the highest surface area, good thermal stability, and also on. But at the same time, because it's still using amine functional groups to capture CO2, what happens is you're still limited by the temperature swing you have to do, 40, 50 degrees C to 120 to 140 degrees C or so. Depending on what chemistry you're using, that dictates the temperature window. So other people are using, well, do we need to really cool the flue gas down to all that temperature to capture CO2? So people worked on high temperature CO2 capture. And two most popular ones at really high temperature CO2 capture are two chemical cycles. First one is carbonation-calcination cycle on the left, you can see. And this is the Zika process I think Klaus worked on a number of years ago at Los Alamos, and then people are still working on in the large-scale demonstration these days. Basically, you're making calcining limestone to spit out CO2 and then capture CO2 with the calcined limestone. So going lime versus limestone, you can capture and release CO2. The benefit of this technology is that limestone is really cheap compared to other materials, so you can use it large scale. But at the same time, limestone is not really porous. So what happens is sometimes if you don't engineer the solvent, you will have only 30% conversion. So a lot of people have been working on, like John Grace talked about yesterday, that how to activate this material so that you can have many, many hundred cycles without having reduced reactivity. So that's one way. Another way was people are looking into chemical looping, which we call it, oxidation reduction cycle. And I'm sure Professor Fan going to talk about a lot more, but I think it kind of started with the water gas shift reaction, how to split this reaction into two. So a lot of water gas shift reactions been used in making synfuels, synthetic fuels, and so on. It's very popular reactions. And basically, water reacts with CO, and you make hydrogen and CO2. But as you can see here, that all these four are gaseous species. Whenever you can, do not mix gaseous species because it's really hard to pull them apart, right? So then by having these two reactors instead of having one water gas shift reactor, you can have no mixing between two gases you're making, CO2 and hydrogen, and only thing going back and forth will be solids. So basically, instead of having air or steam, you're using metal oxide to combust or convert or oxidate your carbonaceous sources, which is a very interesting concept, which Professor Fan is going to talk about more. And but people going back to the liquid solvent because they thought, well, there's benefits of having liquid solvent. So a lot of people worked on various novel technologies. Obviously, these are too early in their development, so that none of these are really doing pilot scale demonstration yet. Smaller pilot people do, and especially in China, a lot of ionic liquid research has been done. Due to time, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but these are some of the examples. Ionic liquid is without any solvent like water. You can be ionic so that you can have different functional groups. And a lot of people, especially group in Notre Dame, been working really well on how to develop these novel materials to do CO2 capture. And unique thing about these materials is that there's no vapor pressure. There's no water, so the cation and anion are really tightly bound, so that they're really fantastic at you can boil them or heat them up to 250 degrees C. There will be no steam coming out or no vapor coming out. So that gives a lot of flexibility for us to do temperature swing in the reactor systems, because compared to MEA, which you will have MEA solvent has high vapor pressure, so that you need to worry about the emissions, gaseous emissions throughout the reactors, but this one doesn't need to. So a lot of people have been working in that area. So it's called anhydrous CO2 capture solvent. Another material is developed by PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Lab, and they've been working on something called cobalt. And this is a unique organic materials that they can do polarity swing, not the temperature or pressure, to capture and release CO2. Another group is working on carbonic anhydrase, and actually Roger Ains, who you met yesterday, he's one of the group leaders working in this area of working with carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase is enzyme. So apparently nature does a lot better than we do in a lot of things, and that's why we mimic nature. And nature been developing this enzyme which does really fast hydration of CO2 in water. So as I mentioned, water is not a really good solvent for CO2 because the hydration of CO2 is very slow and all that so on. But by having this enzyme, you can actually make the CO2 go into the liquid phase, which is water, a lot faster. So this is a unique one, making water better solvent for CO2. A lot of people worked on having dissolved enzymes so that you can actually use water as a solvent, but some of the people also worked on tethering these carbonic anhydrases with different material or combining them in different shell structures like Roger Ains did to use that as CO2 capture kind of particulate system. Another interesting one done by GE, this is the GE Global Research, they worked on this novel material when they capture CO2, it solidifies and becomes powder. So start with at least decent viscosity, and then by reacting with the CO2, you get powder, and once you heat up that powder, you release the CO2 back up, and at the same time it becomes liquid again, so you can recycle back and forth. All these are very interesting, and I was particularly interested in ionic liquid because this material has really good chemical tunability. But then one of the downside was, or my downside, I'm not really good organic chemist, so I decided, well, can we make some, I like the property of it can be chemically tuned very easily, and it doesn't have any vapor pressure up to much higher temperature. Can we make something similar with much cheaper or in much less steps? And that's what we've been working on in my group for a number of years. And I think last 4 or 5 years, we've been working on this material called nanoparticle organic hybrid materials, and basically taking the commercially available polymers and tethering them onto inorganic substrate, you can really improve the thermal stability of these polymeric materials. And a lot of polymers, you can make them somewhat polymeric ionic liquid or ionic materials. And what happens is that if you have really large inorganic substrate and then a little bit of polymer, you'll basically make the polymer coating on your inorganic substrate. So in order for you to keep this into liquid phase like here, it's a viscous, like ionic liquid. Both ionic liquid and NOMs are quite viscous, about like honey-like a consistency. And in order to do that, you have to squeeze the inorganic part as small as possible and then have just right grafting density of the polymers. So what we've been working on was we can start with very tiny inorganic substrate of nanoparticles. Maximum we use is about 20 nanometer. We go down to as small as 1 nanometer. And then by putting different polymers with different functional groups, we were able, and drive off all the water, we end up with materials like this, well-dispersed nanoscale fluid units with the nanoparticle in the center and covered by polymeric fluid, becoming a one fluid unit. And there's no water in this at all. And then you can heat it up, this material, to 350 degrees or so. It doesn't degrade. It doesn't lose any of the, there's no vapor pressure. You can do it hundreds of cycles. And interesting thing about this material is that because these polymers are different structure compared to randomly or arranged just regular liquid polymer, what we started with. So that not only we can chemically functionalize these polymer chains, we were always also getting a benefit of entropic effect of that frustrated structure of the polymers. So it does want to have more CO2 in between these polymer chains and absorb them a lot better. So what we found was this is really interesting material. It captures CO2 in a fantastic way, and it has really jam-packed CO2 in between, so that it even has less volume increase for same amount of CO2 capture. So why don't we do this now? That's a question we do ask. And it's a question for most of the anhydrous CO2 capture solvent group is facing. The high viscosity. If you look at the viscosity of MEA, is right here, close to water. It's a very easy material to work with. And the reason people like low viscosity or liquid solvent was because heat transfer is a lot easier, pumping them is a lot easier, throughout the system it's much easier to process them. But if you have although it's a solvent, if you have high viscosity like ionic liquid, and even worse, what we have as a NOMs, it's a big challenge. How are we gonna do? Mass transfer will be limited. There will be a lot of problem with viscosity of high viscosity fluid to pump them through. So we do have challenges, but at the same time, because of chemical tunability and physical tunability, these, I like to think of it as opportunities, but at least these are the latest research we've been working on in this area. So what would you do once you capture CO2? We talked about storing them. At the end of the day, this is the map from the CO2 utilization. You've seen it yesterday already from NETL. NETL already started to fund a little bit of CO2 utilization projects. Most of them I saw was related to cement, making cements and polycarbonates, or make mineralization and few other projects as well. Although it looks very interesting and very large opportunities, when you really combine it all, it's not that big compared to CO2 emission. So hopefully in the future, when we are thinking about it, majority of CO2 should be avoided by replacing all the electricity generation with renewables. That's the first thing we should do. We should improve our efficiency on anything as much as possible. We need to do it all. But at the same time, once we have CO2 a little bit, and if we have renewable energy, we can go back and forth making all these materials quite a bit. And some of our panelists will talk about details on this, so let me focus on what I work on more than anything. This is mineralization. This mimics the natural process how limestone is made. So nature did it before. CaO reacts with CO2, and then CaCO3 is a downhill. Thermal says it should work. Kinetics not so bad considering geological time scale. So when we look around, we don't really see lime, CaO, we see CaCO3, right? Carbonated materials. And in fact, this research has been done quite a bit in the world because of the industrial waste. And particularly in Europe, a lot of my colleagues have realized that they've been working on this area not because of the CO2 management. It was more on waste management. In Europe, they can't really landfill a lot of their industrial waste, especially if it is high in alkalinity because high pH. So then they've been working on fly ash, cement dust, steel slag, red mud, all these materials, how to make them less active and immobilize a lot of heavy metals in the system. A lot of research has been done. Can you make it more safe for them to either landfill it, or most of cases, they try to use it as construction materials. So a lot of my colleagues in Italy and France and many other places been discussing all these, and especially also Finland and Norway and those areas, we've been talking about how to do carbonate these materials. And all the know-how we learned from there, they said, well, we can apply that for mineralization on many other things. And if you look at the scale of them, unfortunately, these are a lot smaller than CO2 emission. But there's a lot of built-in know-how we should use. And another thing is, as you know, if you can use, for example, steel manufacturing processes are high carbon intensity. So if they can offset their carbon by using their own waste, that's not so bad, right? So a lot of technologies or companies are now looking into, can we use any of the stream within their the power plants or chemical plant to reduce their carbon emissions. But at the end of the day, you do need large-scale solution for CO2 emission because we do emit so much at this point. So then some of the cases you can use, this is the silicate rocks, which we've been working on quite a bit, and some people actually use seawater as well. And all these things, we do not know how much capacity we have because they are far beyond what we need for CO2 capture if you need to look at it. So where are the minerals? We do have quite a bit of them. Here in North America, we have eastern and western United States, not much in the middle, but interestingly, they're where populations are and also where power plants are, which is kind of nice. Although it's relatively far from where coal is. But we have quite a bit of these minerals. And also we have quite a bit in Europe and Australia. They have a lot of these materials for sure. And some of these materials been mined for many years. Magnesium silicate minerals, both serpentine and olivine, we learned a little bit about from Peter Kellerman's talk yesterday, that they are widely mined for many years because of their nickel content. So it wasn't about CO2. For many years, they've been looking at this as a source of nickel. And a lot of good, high-quality ore was about 2% nickel. So they've done that for many years. And then what they found out was we ran out of all these high-grade ones. So then now we have deal with 0.2% nickel in these materials. So we mine them, large quantity. You grind them like crazy because you want to get that small quantity of the nickel. And after that, all this material will be sitting like this as a mining tailing. So that's where we started this research a number of years ago. The companies were saying, well, we have problem with these piles of mining tailing. Can we do something? So some of the people are trying to do air capture in Canada and UBC, in fact, is that they can actually aerate this area and then maybe put a little bit of water, so extract the carbon capture from air using these minerals. Of course, it will take a long time compared to doing it in the reactor, but at the same time, when you think about the scale of the issues, this is not so bad. So a number of people are working in the area. There are many unique situations in nature does it better than others. This is a picture from Oman. One of my colleagues, Gerrard at University of Southampton, took this picture a number of years ago, that this groundwater coming out has very unique properties, very high pH, and high content of alkalinity. So then liquids coming out, groundwater coming out, actually it can capture CO2 from ambient air, very rapid rate, and then make all these trenches. I think Peter Kellerman showed another picture yesterday. So by learning from nature how they does it really fast, we start looking into, can we go down in the energy level like this? And then from carbon to CO2, we do that to extract the energy. But can we go even further so that unless you put energy in, it won't go back up? Means that we don't have a monitoring, verification, and accounting problem because you will be solidifying CO2. And at the end of the day, you want to extract as much energy as possible and materials as possible when we do different conversions. So I think one of my students' poster is showing that when you even do biomass conversion, right, if you need to loop these loops of either carbon mineralization or other carbonations, you can actually gain this energy and put it somewhere else. So I think when you try to achieve the overall sustainability, you should think about how to get this energy and why you're trickle down all the carbon all the way down to lowest energy level, and which is safe and much easier to store. And that was one of the reasons we worked on. So the technology was actually funded out of ARPA-E. We worked on it a number of years, and Pat Brady, you heard him yesterday from Sandia National Lab. He was my co-PI. And we were looking at these reactions using serpentine, which is one of the, but you can start with any industrial waste or any material has alkalinity. And when you do that, what we found out, especially minerals, it's really hard to dissolve. The bottleneck was how to dismantle this magnesium silicate structure to get magnesium ions, and then so you can carbonate them. So we had a bunch of different catalysts we tested. So we were able to get magnesium and silica targeting catalysts. We were able to really digest these minerals super fast so that we can carbonate it using carbonic anhydrous solvent. So that's what we did in the past. But one of the challenges, like a CO2 air capture, we talked about how this area was considered to be too expensive for us to do anything. Mineralization was also condemned that way. Everybody thought it would be too large in scale, too expensive, we should not ever do it. But I guess one of the things we did was by making this process really going fast, the reactor size got tremendously reduced. And by doing so, capital investment was much reduced. So if you look at the overall picture, it kind of looks like this. So we tried to be as scale as possible. Of course, don't quote me on it because we haven't done full analysis yet. But in ballpark, in order of magnitude, this is the size of the mineral dissolution reactor we need to have. A lot smaller. Order of magnitude smaller than what we had before 5, 6, 7 years ago. And this is another reactor for carbonic anhydrous, making carbonate ions, which is a very similar size as MEA reactor. So by having this technology, what we were able to do is, instead of doing CO2 capture, you can directly go from flue gas to solid, and then no solvent regeneration, because we went down the energy level, so you can just store it as much as possible. And in addition, what we found out was we can change the morphological structure and just tailor-make this material to value-added materials. So this is the picture of paper fillers we've been making, or this is paper filler, and we can actually mimic this structure, and we've been making those. But again, only maybe 1% of the stream has to go down this road, and most of them has to go back as a storage. So understanding that will be very important for the future. So what's the problem with CCS? Scale, right? I mean, we've been doing really well on controlling a lot of pollutants in the past, especially from power plants. And this is the picture of how to capture sulfur in the power plant. And I guess a person will be about this size so that you can see the scale of how big this lime spray dryer is. And if you look at the maximum or average maximum concentration of sulfur, which is the SO2 or SOx, in flue gas, it's the parts per million level, right? And can you imagine how big the unit has to be to capture CO2, which is a 15 volume%? So this is one of the biggest issues we have to think about. Some of the old power plant may not even have an area big enough to host this reactor. So what are the issues, current challenges? Lowering parasitic energy consumption will be a big deal. And hopefully we'll be able to do good heat integration and so on, so that, and combine maybe with the compression and all that, maybe we can reduce the the parasitic energy consumption. And a lot of people are doing quite smart way doing that. The anhydrous solvents like ionic liquid and my material gnomes, we have problem with viscosity. And a lot of us are working on how to reduce that viscosity. And another big problem is a lot of people don't talk about is moisture effect. So most of the CO2 capture technology researchers, they work with pure CO2 usually, and then do the testing of their materials. But do we have pure CO2 in flue gas? No, not likely, right? Usually 15 volume percent. Usually people try with the 15 volume percent. Sometimes they even add sulfur. But in fact, a lot of this flue gas, or all the flue gas, is quite moist. So understanding how water play a role, the moisture coming along the ride with CO2 will be very important. Because if we try to say anhydrous solvent or even solid solvent, they may have a lot of issues with water. So people do not talk about it a lot, but in fact, a lot of CO2 capture technologies, they actually have dehumidifier before CO2 capture unit. And that will be the biggest discussion we should have as well. And multi-pollutant control will be nice if we can capture sulfur and CO2 at the same time, many other things. By doing so, hopefully we'll minimize number of units and then use the material smart way. And water requirement is another big deal. If you're doing MEA technology, you do know that power plants are usually located near the river, right? Because it does require a lot of water. You cannot be inland when there's no water. So producing energy always takes a lot of water. But if we decide to use water-based solvent, how much additional water do we need to use? That could be another big challenge we need to talk about. And last, these novel materials, although it has a lot of challenges, but also opens up a lot of opportunities. So one of the examples is you can actually do CO2 capture and conversion. And I remember, I think 3-4 years ago, I met Andy Bocarsly at ACS meeting and started talking about, he was using liquid-based, water-based electrolyte, and then which doesn't have good CO2 solubility. And I had a material with the good CO2 solubility. So can we somehow combine it so that my material becomes not only CO2 capture medium, but also becomes electrolyte to host electrochemical reduction of CO2. So that's one of the areas we're working on. So I showed you there's a lot of challenges, but at the same time, a lot of opportunities. And I'm hoping that this RCN Research Coordination Network will be a good place for us to really discuss how can we solve these problems, combined effort. Thank you so much. And let me introduce you speakers. We have 5 excellent panelists who are going to give a short presentation first. First one is Professor Andy Bocarsly at Princeton University. He's been working on this CO2 conversion for many years, and in fact, he has one of the most successful, I think, spin-off startup on liquid light, and he's working with them. So he's going to talk about how he got there, and then what is the next exciting move. Yeah.
Okay, good morning. I'm here wearing 2 hats this morning. One is as a chemistry professor at Princeton and the other as a co-founder of Liquid Light. And I'm going to focus on Liquid Light. But what Liquid Light is doing comes out of our labs at Princeton initially, so I'm going to start there. And we'll move forward from that point. Okay, so thinking about this now from the point of view of starting a business and how can one be successful and whatnot, we started off with 2 potential opportunities. One was the idea that one wants to remove CO2 from the air by whatever means and turn it into something useful. And the other was simply as a way of making fuels or chemicals and selling those. And it turns out that first idea of removing CO2 is not a very good business plan. That is, nobody's willing to pay you today to remove CO2. And if you want to start a company today, you need something that in the short term is going to make some money. So we at Liquid Light have focused on the idea that we're going to take CO2 and turn it into commodity or bulk chemicals. I think initially we said fuels, but now any bulk chemical will do, including fuels. If you're going to think about that, then the competition is using CO2 as a feedstock versus using petroleum-based feedstocks, fossil fuel feedstocks. CO2, of course, is a heavily oxidized form of carbon. Fossil fuels essentially are heavily reduced forms of carbon. So whether you're going to win, if you will, using this feedstock versus this feedstock depends on exactly what you want to make. So you can think about this in terms of, is the product I want to make heavily oxidized or is it going to be more reduced? And if I want to make something that's fairly oxidized, then starting with CO2 makes a lot of sense in terms of the energetics and hence the cost. And if I want to end up with something quite reduced, then probably starting with fossil fuels is still the way to go. So what we've done here is we've compared the costs of generating various materials in terms of energy cost, right? So you're looking at numbers here in gigajoules per ton. And the green numbers have to do with using CO2, and the dark color numbers have to do with the fossil fuel resource. All of the compounds that you see up here have been generated either in my labs or the liquid light labs. In fact, a lot more have been generated. We've generated about 30 different compounds at this point from CO2. Most of them not optimized, but we've seen them. All of these we certainly have seen. And this first stream here you can see are all products that have just one carbon in them. So let's look at that for 1 second. Again, if you want to go and generate methanol, I'm going to focus on that, and I'll tell you why in a second, then you can see it's fairly reduced, and so you win if you make it from a natural gas type of resource. It takes a little more energy if you're going to make it from CO2. On the other hand, if you want to make formic acid, then it takes a lot less energy to generate from CO2 than it does from a petroleum-based feedstock. So it just depends where you want to be on this scheme. You not only can make C1 products, it turns out that you can make C2 products as shown here, and larger molecules as shown down here. And in general, we follow this scheme that if it's heavily reduced, then lower energy costs associated from fossil fuel. If it's more oxidized, lower energy costs associated with CO2. Now, on top of this, we have to layer the fact that we want to do this electrochemically. And so our most expensive resource or reagent in this chemistry we want to do is going to be the cost of electricity. So we have to layer that on top of all this. So for example, in addition to the fact that methanol here can be made a little more cheaply in terms of energy use from fossil fuel, we have to take into account the fact that methanol from CO2 requires 6 electrons. So cost of electricity is very high on top of the energy cost. On the other hand, formic acid only requires 2 electrons, so we have a lower electricity cost associated with that. So as we go through that, we can divide this up, and essentially we have the green ones. Our analysis says we win by doing it electrochemically from CO2, and the not so green ones mean that there's probably a better way to do it than we have suggested so far. That is, best ways are still from fossil fuels. Okay. Now, usually when I give talks, I talk about methanol, and I will do that today also because based on that analysis I just told you, Liquid Light has decided that they're not going to make methanol. So I think it's a great chemistry problem. As a professor of chemistry, how do you take CO2 and shove 6 electrons into it and 6 protons to turn to methanol? It's a wonderful chemistry problem. All kinds of catalysis issues and many of the issues that Alissa brought up. Liquid Light is not too concerned that I'm going to give away the shop by doing that. So that's what we're going to talk about that. But in fact, that's not what we want to make, okay, for the reasons stated. Okay, so that's where we'll kind of focus as an example. What we really want to do is the reaction of CO2 to oxalic acid, because that's a C2 product. It's way on the left here, heavily oxidized. We don't have big electricity costs associated with making it. And once you have this material, then you can, it's a doorway for generating a wide number of C2 products, in particular a whole range of glycol-based products which have bulk chemicals that are quite interesting. So that's where we're going, but we're going to look at methanol to start with. And for that matter, formic acid, which you'll notice also actually looks pretty attractive from an industrial point of view. Okay, now all those numbers I just showed you, the black numbers are based on actually what it costs energetically in the industry to do it. We have good numbers for that. All those green numbers that from CO2, there are not good industrial numbers for. That's chemistry we're developing. Those numbers are based right now on a thermodynamic calculation plus something added on to take into account that we're not going to be able to do it right at the thermodynamic minimum. But to hit those numbers, we're going to need a good catalyst for doing this. And that's actually the basis for Liquid Light, coming up with new electrocatalysts for carrying out this operation. And what started all this was our observation at Princeton that pyridine, or pyridinium, protonated pyridine, a very inexpensive compound, in an aqueous solution, turns out to be a marvelous catalyst for converting CO2 to methanol. And the route, it turns out, from converting CO2 to methanol goes through formic acid and formaldehyde, so it follows that whole stream I showed you on the top. So if you don't want to make methanol, for the reasons I already stated, but want to make formic acid, pyridine will do this also. Okay. And what this does is it dramatically drops the activation barrier for carrying out the chemistry. If you look at the literature prior to our publications on this, speaking in electrochemical terms, it took about a volt of extra driving potential to convert CO2 to any of these products. And when the pyridine is present, we drop that down to about 0.2 volts, 200 millivolts, to run a diffusion limited process in water. So we've dramatically decreased it. And now with a catalyst like pyridine, all those numbers I showed you on the last slide make sense. Okay, we're playing in a reasonable ballpark now. And it turns out it's not limited to pyridine. This is the first compound that we explored, and we stumbled across it quite serendipitously. But basically, aromatic amines carry out this sort of chemistry, and depending which aromatic amine you use, you will get different products. So it depends what you want to make. Pyridine is good for making methanol. Okay, when we started off in my lab, this was the great breakthrough right here. Okay. As Lisa already pointed out, if you want to, if your goal besides making chemicals is to get rid of CO2, probably getting your electricity, if you're doing electrochemically, from a coal-fired power plant of all things is exactly the wrong way to do it. In fact, if you do the analysis, you will generate 2 moles of CO2 for every mole that you get rid of if you use a coal-fired power plant. So you've lost on the environmental side before you started. Okay, so what you want to use is an alternate source that does not generate CO2. And so we proposed that we could do this photoelectrochemically, where we have a little electrochemical cell. Whoops, let's go back. Electrochemical cell here that uses a semiconductor as the electrode. And this one that we published on happens to use P-type gallium phosphide. Or an aqueous electrolyte with all its limitations. We have the pyridine in there. We're illuminating that right here with a small LED to demonstrate it works. And what was important about this cell is we made methanol in the cell from CO2, from pyridine, and we did that with essentially all the electrons. 96% of the electrons went into making the methanol. And we did it at this very low potential, over potential that I told you we could operate at. So that's the proof of concept. That's the good news. The bad news is, this is a great chemistry experiment, but that is a 50 milliliter round bottom flask, right? And that is a semiconductor, which is about 0.1 square centimeters of surface area that's active. So how do you take that and turn that into anything that is useful at all? And that takes a lot of engineering. And it's certainly not going to be done quite this way. The first problem is actually the semiconductors. Nobody really has commercialized the photoelectrochemical process. So if you're talking about doing something and you want it to happen in the next couple of years, oh, this is a great idea, I think. Hopefully it will work someday for real. You're not going to do this in the next few years. You have high costs associated with the semiconductor. You have to worry about how you get light into the system if it's a really big system. There's all sorts of issues here. So the first thing you certainly want to do is convert this over to a more conventional electrolyzer where you use metal electrodes and worry about your electricity source a little differently. So this is a nice chemical solution, but it's not a very elegant engineering solution. But it's the genesis of what Liquid Light attempted to do, or is attempting to do. Okay, there's a second issue that comes into this, and that it's not just this molecule you're going to put in a solution that's needed for the catalysis, but it turns out that the surface of the electrode is a key second catalyst, or probably the first catalyst. So it's probably worth talking about the electrode material as the catalyst, and that molecule I'm going to add in as your co-catalyst in this system. And so even though we start with the co-catalyst, we have gone back and looked at a lot of electrodes, and it's very subtle effects in many cases. But it's a big and very important effect. So staying with that gallium phosphide for a moment, if that was a single crystal electrode I was showing you. If I simply change the crystal face by cutting it differently, I will get dramatically different product distributions from that system. So it's a very, very subtle effect. Now I'm switching over here to a metal electrode because I already told you Liquid Light's going to have to deal with a metal electrode. And this is an indium electrode. And we've actually just submitted this work for publication at Princeton. And what we've simply done here, just to show the effect, this is an indium electrode, a standard electrolyzer, taking CO2, aqueous CO2, to formic acid. No pyridine is present in the system. It turns out that the indium electrode, by itself, is somewhat catalytic for this process. So here we are sitting at, whoops, let's
push the wrong button here. Sitting at minus 1.6 volts versus SCE, saturated calomel electrode, and we have our indium electrode there, and we're making a certain amount of formic acid there.
And in looking at that system, we came to the conclusion that this system was somewhat active for making formic acid, not because it was indium metal, but because the indium metal was oxidized, and it was an indium oxide on the surface that was actually the electric catalyst. So we went and intentionally placed that oxide on the surface, and you can see you jump up here to something like 70+% Faradaic efficiency when that oxide is present on the surface. And in fact, it turns out when you do the whole analysis, it's actually an indium hydroxide, which is the magic catalyst on this surface. Okay, so if you know that, of course, then you can start building electrodes that carry out that process rather efficiently. So we have to worry about what's on the surface, and we have to worry about what's in solution. I tell you about this because Liquid Light's formic acid process is in fact based on indium electrodes. And so engineering of the electrode surface as well as the co-catalyst are your key efforts there. Okay, now that's so much for chemistry. I've bored you with that long enough. Let's go to Liquid Light. So here's the idea. We're going to have a standard electrochemical cell. We're going to carry out a reduction over here, cathode compartment, which is CO2, aqueous. Even with all its problems, water does have some good things going for it, like it has protons in it, which we need to make the products. At one electrode, metal electrode, we're going to oxidize water at the other electrode to generate oxygen. We'll get our CO2 from whatever wonderful source you guys want to supply it to us from, as long as we have a lot of it and it's fairly clean. And then we'll use whatever alternate energy resource you want to drive this. So it could be photovoltaics, it could be wind, anything will work as long as we don't use a petroleum-based power plant and we want to generate liquids as products. So that's the whole idea here. And it works. Okay, so what do you have to do? You take that, remember that 50 milliliter round bottom I showed you before? Well, you throw out the semiconductor, you find some inexpensive base metals that work, indium being one example of a metal that will work in these systems. And you redesign your electrochemical cell now so that it's a flow cell. So that's one flow cell right there. 100 square centimeters of active area in this cell. We're coming in with an anode and a cathode flow from the two sides here. You can see the plumbing. And we are generating formic acid in this particular cell. We've taken 3 of these cells in this case, so we have 300 square centimeters of active area as a demonstration here. Running in, again, just water-saturated CO2, actually with bicarb supporting electrolyte. There is no electricity from the wall supplied in this system, but if you've crossed the river and gone to New Jersey recently, you'll notice just about every telephone pole in New Jersey has these photovoltaics on them, which PSE&G has installed. So they generously lent us one, so that's one of those panels. All the electricity from this system is coming out of that panel, which is sitting out in the parking lot of Liquid Light, which is 10 minutes away from Princeton. Okay, and we're running that cell, that small stack, 3-cell stack. And this is a real life experiment that we did just about a year ago, you notice. Okay, and our blue curve here is simply a power meter that's showing our solar input as the day goes on here. So we started pretty early in the morning. We're just running for a couple hours here. We got a little downward spike there because a cloud came out and went over our experiments. This is the real thing, right? And what I want to point out to you is that our formic acid is exactly following our solar insolation here. Number one, and number two is in this particular experiment, as long as the sun is shining, we're getting about, we'll call it 2 to 3% energy conversion efficiency. So what we're doing to get that efficiency is we're collecting the formic acid that we're making, and we're doing a calculation that if we burnt up that formic acid, how much energy would it release? Okay? And we do it this way simply because this is the comparison point in the literature. Okay. A couple important things about this experiment. First important thing is this thermionic efficiency for a green plant taking in sunlight is about 1%.
Now the number I'm showing you here, this happens to be the best experiment that we've ever done, and this is a little high number. If we do this a series of times, a better number is just shy of 2%, something like 1.8 to 1.9%. But that beats just artificial photosynthesis by 100%, okay? 1% up to 2% right there. Number two is there have been other people that have made big claims about this, and in particular, Panasonic has made claims about taking CO2 to formic acid using a photoelectric chemical cell, a cell similar to the one that I showed you before, but based on gallium nitride, and their conversion efficiency is 0.2%, tenfold smaller than what I'm showing you here. They put out a big press release a year ago about this, claiming this was a great victory. Okay, and I simply want to point out that we're using off-the-shelf components here, a commercially available PV and a pre-commercial cell, electrolyzer cell, and we do 10 times better. Okay, so this, you need to do better than this probably, but this sets the low limit. That is, anybody that does worse than this is not adding to the advantage that's here. Okay, so that's what can be done. Now I told you what Liquid Light really wants to do is make oxalic acid. So this is our pre-commercial electrolyzer for doing this. This electrolyzer uses the same cell design over here that I was showing you for the formic acid system, 100 square centimeters of active area. That's a scalable design. In fact, now the area of the electrodes is twice that is 200 square centimeters. So we have a design that's scalable. It's a flow cell with electrolyte and an anode compartment going in and out, and a cathode compartment going in and out. We have pressurized solvent containers. We're putting in CO2 here, taking out oxygen out of the system. This is a system that will work either in an aqueous mode or a non-aqueous mode. Actually, it's been demonstrated both ways. And this is a system that, as configured right here, is generating oxalic acid. It's completely instrumented and automated. And this is a system now that ballpark generates a kilogram of oxalic acid. Right, it's less than that, but that's the order of magnitude for this. This is a system that is scalable up to a proto plant type system, which is what Liquid Light is interested in doing at this point. And in this particular case, they're making calcium oxalate, and it really works. There it is right there. And again, it's been making a kilogram. Runs right now are between 100 and 1,000 hours. They need to be longer than that, but we're well on our way to making chemical products from CO2 and alternate energy. Thank you for your attention.
So next speaker will be, let's mix up with the CO2 capture and conversion a bit. So next speaker will be Professor Ellis Fan from the Ohio State University. He's going to talk about the chemical looping technology. He's been developing this technology for a number of years, and in fact, this is one of the most successful demonstration projects done by DOE. So he's going to talk about a little bit about that.
Thank you very much, Alissa, for your introduction and invitation. You gave a very good perspective of the carbon capture as well as the utilization. I would like just to give some little bit of details on the chemical looping aspect of the technology and that contributing to the CO2 capture as well as utilization. So just very briefly, as a general information for chemical loopings, there are two types. Full oxidation types that basically were undergoing the metal oxide and metal oxidation reductions. And I would say, if you want to categorize the chemical looping, that will be under oxy-combustion, because the differences here is oxygen is not coming from the molecular aspect through air separation. Instead, it is coming out from the metal oxide and through its letters oxygen. So this is the type where you have any carbonaceous feedstocks coming in and undergoing the reductions for the metal oxide, and then the carbonaceous will be oxidized to CO2 and H2O, and metal oxide is being reduced to metal. And then the second reactor is carrying out whatever the things you would like to carry out. And if you're using air as the oxidizing agent to regenerate metal to metal oxide, recycle back into the reduction reactors, and you would generate heat, tremendously heat, and then that would be converted into electricity. But then if you react or introduce steams, and you would generate hydrogens. If you introduce a CO2, introduce carbon monoxide, introduce a combination of CO2 and the steams, you will get a syngas. So this reactor is here to perform various type of function depending on the product. And I might add that if you do the combustion of the metal, let's say iron, the heat of reaction is very much the same as you would do if you do the combustion of carbon, and about 400 kilojoule per mole. And then the second type is a swing between the metal oxide and the metal carbonates, and one of the typical example is a calcium, and the calcium oxide, calcium carbonate is sending in to capture the CO2, and this has been very extensively discussed. I'm sure Professor John Grace spoke for that, and Alissa mentioned as well. So I'm not talking much about this particular one. So this would be the one I would focus in terms of the using particularly iron or all other type of metal oxide and to perform the oxidation reduction reactions. The second type is a selective oxidation. In other words, I would not generate the CO2 at all. So instead, I generate other type of useful product. And so I don't have to go through the CO2 conversion into those products anymore. But exactly how to do it is a lot to do with what kind of metal oxide you use and what the contact modes you're going to use, and the reactor you're going to use. So they are a huge in-depth engineering components there. And then just talking about the first one, if you're using coal or any carbonaceous, particular today, a very attractive feedstock is shale gas. If you're using shale gas and send into the chemical looping, it will give you the syngas. And I want to give you a little bit more specific results. You are able to do it, a shale gas conversion to syngas at a 2-to-1 ratio of hydrogen to carbon monoxide at a purity of syngas of 85% without using molecular oxygen, without using steam, and carry out these particular reactions. And then the economic outcome would be saving at least 50% in capital cost as well as operating cost. And so this is being demonstrated in my laboratory at the sub-pilot level. And in my sort of observation, this will be the first commercial conversion technology or chemical looping. It expected to be taking places within the next 4 to 5 years. And then this one would be, instead of syngas, you directly convert it into chemicals. And it is doable, except that today, that particular yield is not high enough to be of commercial, beneficial at this point. And we're working on that as well. And this is the one do not involve any carbonaceous or fossil energy at all. So what you do here is you simply using solar energy and do the decomposition of the metal oxide to metal and oxygen, and then you can treat metal in the way you would do in the oxidation system as you would do in the usual chemical looping system. So you can generate hydrogens, you can generate combustion, the heat, and so forth. Because of this system, which is totally renewable in a sense because you're using solar energy as the energy source, and this would be with us as long as there's a solar system. And so what I'm saying here is chemical looping is not necessarily the way conceived and just for the fossil energy, but also for things beyond. I wanted to mention why chemical looping is so attractive. And in fact, in a roadmap of the DOE, there are 3 technologies considered to be the ultimate technology, and the other 2 technology are the oxygen transport membrane. As you can imagine, if you are able to do so, and is at very little processing energy requirement, and you can do a lot of oxidation reactions without much of the air separation energy requirements. And the other one is the biological processes go through the genetic engineering, metabolic engineering, and one of the best examples is taking sugars and converting to normal or isobutanol. And then in the chemical looping, because of the versatility, which actually I want to picture to you as being a platform that can do many things, not just combustion, is being usually associated chemical looping too. So it is more than that. And I use, let's say, full combustion and hydrogen generation as an example to show the efficiencies. If we produce hydrogen using chemical looping, efficiency 80% as compared to some of the other more existing techniques, which included this gasification water gas shift reactions, IGCC selector process, ultra supercritical, followed by MEA, CO2 captures, and so forth, and including membrane as well. And on the other side, if it is 100% electricity generation, chemical looping will give you 45% yield. And this is followed by the usual steam turbine or gas turbine, not a fuel cell. And then compared to the traditional, is 30% plus minus. And this is a scenario under the condition that CO2 capture is required. Okay. And from the thermodynamic second law to look at this chemical looping, you will see also using hydrogen generation as an example. You started with a carbon. This is a simplified system just to illustrate an idea. If you started with a carbon, goes through the gasification reaction to producing gas and water gas shifted to produce hydrogens. And you see a 3 number given here in each one of the box. The first number is enthalpy. The second is exergy. The third is exergy rate. So carbon, we all know, is 407. But if you walk down into the hydrogen and exergy drops. And using traditional path, exergy will be lost and then give you over efficiency 79.2%. Of course, in the real system, never be that high. But you know, I did the calculations here, just basically if I can make the heat transfer or heat neutral, and you can make a lot of assumptions just to show the comparison with another cases if the chemical looping is used using iron oxide. You go through the partial oxidation to produce iron, and then go to this the water splitting to generate hydrogen, and then the metal oxide recycle back into the original the systems and go through the process again. And efficiency is 94.5. So not only just the thermal first law tell you actually is higher in terms of you using the chemical looping compared to other systems, but second law show that as well. And the reason why it's so strong and so good is because there's exergy recuperation schemes, and iron oxide play that particular role. And the economics, you can see also here, in terms of the COE, which is the cost of electricity reductions, and the CO2 capture compared to amine techniques with the base plan information. This is the benchmark results coming from the DOE. You add it into MEA and compare with the co-directed chemical looping, and the COE, which is the cost of electricity, increases 33% compared to if you're using traditional way of doing it, 71%. Of course, everybody can argue the number, but this number actually, in some cases, can come down to about 20% and 15% as well. So, so basically, if you want to look at the cost of electricity reduction of prosthetic energy requirement, and there's no technology can do better than chemical looping. But it is a second generation type of technology. And so comparison is totally unfair because you know, you do retrofit and based on the current one, post-combustion, pre-combustion and so forth, compared to the new generation. But this is simply to say, this is some sort of goal we are aiming at. If technology can be really commercialized and there's a potential CO2 will be just a part of the product, you don't need to do separation. And then the technology in terms of commercialization today, at a large scale demonstration, this is pretty much the summary. Basically, I mentioned about two types. This is not including the syngas, the partial oxidation. This is all full oxidations. So basically, they are technology, about a two type of the type 1, which is production using iron oxide and to produce either electricity or hydrogens. And this particular type 1 demonstration system, one is in the Darmstadt units in Germany, and the other one is at Ohio State, is our system, which is demonstrated 250 kilowatts to 3 megawatts. And this is a demonstration for hydrogen production as well as the pure CO2 productions. And this particular demonstration is taking place at a high pressure. So it's a pressurized system. And then the Darmstadt units using immunite or iron-based material, 1 megawatt system, and then produce the electricity. And then the type 2 system in a larger scale, and this is Hanusa spin, and it's 2 megawatts being under operations with the two CFB systems, and the one is calcination and the other one is the carbonations. And another units on the type 2 is E3 units, which is Taiwan, demonstrating at the 2 megawatt system. And we licensed the technology into Taiwan, E3s, and they are doing it based on two kind of modes. One is calcination carbonation, is one kind, and the other kind is calcination carbonation and hydration. If you add hydration to the system, the calcium oxide can be continue operating many, many cycles. And one of the key points of this technology has to do with the metal oxide. As you can see, the Allingham diagrams give you the free energy with the temperature. So many of the manganese oxide, copper oxide, cupric oxide, hematites, magnetites, and the immunites, and so forth, calcium sulfate, and compared to the CO2 baseline. So anything about that, it can be used to be reduced and eventually produce the full oxidation of CO2. And the CO lines here, so you needed to be in here of this metal oxide in order to do the partial oxidation. So this particular diagram is very helpful in terms of on our iron oxide selections, but certainly the key point has a lot to do with which one is the better ones and what are the mixtures as a support and to allow such kind of particle be made. Okay, and of course on top, which is most important, is recyclability and reactivity, and has to be cheap. If you started with nickel, yes, it worked very well, but it won't be a commercial metal oxide. And one of the key points I just want to mention about from particle standpoint of view is not a pore diffusion, they are nuisance diffusions. Things like this is actually is the ionic diffusions, cation vacancies, defects, and the drives the oxygen move in and out, iron move in and out, and so forth. And the electrons are holes and so forth. So one of the typical examples I want to show you, an ionic diffusion of this kind of high temperature metallic composite. If you have a mixture of aluminum oxide and iron oxide, it goes through the oxidation reduction 50 times, and you will see iron oxide is situated outside as shell. So this is the one way to produce core and shell particle as well. And this is further confirmed and to the EDX and the XRD, and you can see this particular situation, aluminum oxide, iron oxide, and you look at the surface, look at the inside, and the outside is iron, inside is alumina. So it's a core and shell, but then if you switch to titanium oxide and to do very much the same thing, and you find out there's no separation. So the particles still continue after 50 micron, 50 cycle is just maintained to be a mixed metal oxide. So this is a lot to do with selection of the support and that support your active metal oxide, and that will give you the kind of results you want. And then recently we have discovered already why this happened and how pressure affect this particular metal oxide reactions. It is very, very fascinating, and we'll report those results later. And another aspect is to do with the contact modes, fluidized bed or moving bed. And you can see basically two types of system and dictates or drive the engineering system to carry out this chemical looping. European system, all the other groups are using the fluidized bed as the reducers, and the combustor oxidation site is pretty much set as a fluidized bed riser. But the differences really is in the reducer. And the reducer differences has a huge, huge impact. Eventually, is scalable or not scalable, and what product you're going to generate. And this is Ohio State, is our systems, and the countercurrent moving bed. And this has a pattern. We understand there's no pattern on this one. And once this is pattern, actually it took 7 years to get this pattern because people tend to think the iron making process is very similar to this type of process. The only differences here is in this particular looping application, the product going out cannot contain unreacted, the syngas. So it has to be a CO2 outlet. And then if you do the metallurgical processing like the blast furnace, and eventually your objective is to produce the iron from the iron ore. But you can have a lot of reducing gas going out, but you cannot allow to have this situation. Therefore, you need to do certain things and to make that happen. So this is the main differences. It translated into the main characteristic of differences in performance is that if you start both using iron oxide Fe2O3 hematite and fluidized bed versus the countercurrent moving bed, a fluidized bed will only reduce this to the magnetite Fe3O4. And this allows you to reduce all the way to Fe and FeO combinations. There's a reason because the phase diagram of the iron oxide relative to the partial pressure of the carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide is such that when you use a fluidized bed, and this ratio is going to be situated here, so you cannot really adjust the oxidation state of iron all the way to here because this is just the thermodynamics. Okay. As a result, you are able to donate much more oxygen if using moving bed as compared to using fluidized bed. And then translate it into huge differences in terms of the loading ratios and so forth. And I'm going to just to show you one result. This is the one currently under pilot demonstration at NCCC Merritt in the Alabama. This is a kind of system. You first has reducer followed by oxidizer, and iron oxide Fe2O3 reduced to Fe, and a combination with the FeO. And this work with the steam to do the splitting to generate hydrogen. And then in the process, Fe is oxidized to magnetite, Fe3O4. This is thermodynamically, you can only oxidize to Fe3O4, and so you need to go through the combustion again, and then putting air, and to oxidize all the way to Fe2O3. So this is a syngas chemical looping system, and to produce pure hydrogen and the pure CO2. And this particular scheme is very attractive because we have been talking about to use the CO2, and you have to ask the one basic question, where the CO2 coming from? If you're using any feedstocks, and CO2 automatically come out from here, if you want to react CO2 with hydrogen, you take this string and take this string, and immediately they can reacts to produce fluoric acids and the methanols and things like this, and in liquid fuel, and by adding the catalyst. Okay, so I just show you the results, and you can see under 300 plus hours, actually more than that now, and you can generate CO2 coming from the reducer of pure 100%, 99.99, and the hydrogen come out as 99.99 as well in the oxidizer. And this has been verified by the NCCC's facility, which is a larger scale. And you can also using coal, and if you introduce coal to do the coal combustion, this is one of the results. You can see the CO2 can be generated in close to pure, and then very little methane and carbon monoxide come out. And one of the very interesting things is nitrogen oxide. Nitrogen oxide, because the temperature of the combustion is not very high, it's 900 degree, 950 degree, so thermal NOx is not present. As a consequence, your NOx emission is about 40% of what you would see in a polarized coal combustion. Okay, and this is probably the best way to compare, using fluidized bed mode. And this is the dense star units, I mentioned it, and it was reported in the clear water conferences, and compared to our system, 1 megawatts, the differences. And this is a direct moving bed system. Coal is introduced and regenerated with iron oxide and recycled. And in the process, there's no mechanical conveyor necessary to convey the regenerate the particles to the reducer side from the regeneration side. And the carbon do not require to be removed before this solid, before the metal oxide is to be sent to the regenerator. Carbon in a fluidized bed, you all know, mixed with iron oxide, and you have to take out the iron, take out the copper, take out the carbon before it's sent to the combustor. Otherwise, the CO2 will come out from here. That's what you don't want. You want all the CO2 captured. And also, because of coal introduced, there will be some volatile material coming out, and then you have to do the post-combustion to remove those methanes, carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and so forth, coming from volatile. But this system do not require that kind of the operations, and simply because coal is introduced here in the middle, and the volatile goes up, it's been interacting with iron oxide and totally oxidize it to CO2 and H2O, and then the char is go through the gasification, and then only the iron oxide particle recycle back into the system. And so you can see 200 hours operation continuously of this subpilot without issues. And this unit is currently being considered for moving towards the pilot demonstration very quickly by Cox, and the commercial design is already being mapped out. So with this, thank you very much for your attention.
Next speaker is Professor Chris Jones from Georgia Tech. He's a professor in chemical engineering, and he's been working on a lot of interesting catalysis and CO2 capture technologies in the past, and he will talk about some of the latest.
All right, thank you, Alissa, for inviting me to participate in this panel today. And I'd like to talk mostly about CO2 capture from air, because I wasn't here on Monday and I missed most of the discussion for that. I apologize for not being able to be here at that time. As Alissa pointed out, I'm in chemical engineering at Georgia Tech, and my group works primarily in carbon capture and catalysis. So we work on both CO2 upgrading via thermal catalytic routes, complementary to what we heard about from Bocarsly, and also carbon capture both from flue gas and from air. And I have posters on both of those topics out there in the hallway. What I thought I'd do today is to walk through what I see to be the major differences in how I think about taking CO2 out of the air versus taking CO2 out of flue gases. And this table here shows you some significant differences with regard to the amount of CO2 available, distribution, temperature, contaminants, and movement. And at the bottom, I point out that in the short term, if we're going to do this on a practical scale, we have to do this in a way that we can make money. So in the short term, we think about CO2 as a source for fuel or chemical synthesis. And the hope is that we get on the learning curve and we learn to develop these processes and drop the cost such that at some point then in the medium term, we could potentially think about doing this in parallel with post-combustion capture, pre-combustion capture, et cetera, to address climate change. So in this table, you see that I've highlighted a few things that I think are challenges for these different technologies in red. And so the key challenge, obviously, to take CO2 out of the air to try to purify something that's very dilute is the fact that it's down at about 400 ppm. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at that, we're quickly raising that number, so my job gets easier each and every year. But it's rising relatively slowly, and it'll be a long time before it gets to the values that we see for flue gas at 5 to 15%. The things that are in blue are the other things that I think are worth pointing out. So we have about a 300-fold difference, 400-fold difference in concentration dealing with CO2 and air to flue gas. But we also have a lot more CO2 to play with that's already out in the atmosphere, which allows us to do this anywhere we want. So from a siting perspective, undoubtedly it's easier to work on air capture from a siting perspective than to deal with the cramped confines around a 60-year-old power plant, for example. Contaminants are a major issue for both approaches, and it turns out that for CO2 capture from air with the materials that I'm interested in, which are primarily based on amine materials, oxygen is the big challenge. And how do you design a material that can withstand degradation associated with oxygen, especially if you're doing thermal cycling. And in fact, this is a big advantage of the humidity swing approach that Klaus has talked about in the past and may talk about today, in that you don't have to deal with high temperatures if you're doing humidity swing. In flue gas, you also have to deal with SOx and NOx, which are not an issue for us when we deal with air capture. The values are sufficiently low that those types of contaminants do not affect the amine materials that we work with. But movement of gas is critically important in both processes, and in fact, it's most important in air capture from the perspective of that dilution factor. We have to move 300 times more air to capture a kilogram of CO2 if we were to capture 100% of the CO2, given that factor of dilution. And in fact, we don't capture 100% of the CO2 that goes through our process. So if we think about these air capture approaches that you've probably heard about, supported amine adsorbents is the one that I work on via temperature swing or vacuum swing adsorption. Klaus Lackner has invented and popularized humidity swing adsorption. There's the aqueous alkaline solution approach that was well documented and studied in the American Physical Society report. People have used for a long time aqueous amine solutions, which is the classical approach to post-combustion capture as well. In fact, all of the military submarines primarily have used that in the past, and they're working now to change over that technology from a solution-based process to a solid-supported process. Then you've got solid alkaline adsorbents at high temperatures, and you also have heard about mineral sequestration at this conference. The top one is really the one that I'm going to focus on because that's what I work on in collaboration with Global Thermostat, who you heard from on Monday. So if I try to explain to a broad audience what are the technological needs we need to deal with in order to make practical CO2 capture from air available, there's 5 items that I'd like to highlight that are put on this particular slide. First and foremost, because we have to move a very large amount of CO2 through the process, a large amount of air through the process, we absolutely have to have a low pressure drop contactor. So a low pressure dropped high surface area contactor is critical. That's item number 1. The second is that we need to have an adsorbent that can sufficiently extract the CO2 out of the air, given low temperature conditions, and that requires good adsorbent thermodynamics. And when I mean that, I mean a strong binding energy. So in my context, good thermodynamics means a strong binding energy, and a reasonable hypothesis that we use to identify materials is to say we'd like a high heat of adsorption, because that will often lend itself towards a high Henry's constant, giving us a steep isotherm. The adsorbent also has to have good kinetics. So one of the challenges associated with packing a lot of adsorption sites onto a solid material, for example, in some of the materials that were described by Alissa earlier, is that you get very, very slow mass diffusion of CO2 to the sites. And so you have to design the material such that you can get a very rapid diffusion of CO2 to the sites so that they can adsorb. So adsorbent kinetics are number 3. Number 4 is a low-cost source for adsorbent regeneration. This is where the money comes in. You have to pay for energy in order to regenerate your adsorbent. You can use that energy in the form of pulling a vacuum. You can use that energy in the form of heating it up. Adsorption is exothermic, desorption is endothermic. We have to put energy into the system in order to regenerate it. And then the 5th one is a low acceptable capital cost and ultra-long process material lifetime. And it's number 5 that really requires us to get out there and build facilities and operate them for years at a time such that we can get data under practical conditions to know whether the process we've designed, the sorbent we've designed, will it last a year, 5 years, 10 years, etc. So I'd like to walk through these one by one for you and show you at least a solution to these challenges. The first is for the low pressure dropped high surface area contactor. An obvious approach for someone like myself who works in catalysis is to use the types of contactors we use in catalysis for similar applications, which would be these monolith contactors. So monolith contactors could be available from on the order of 4 or 5 companies around the world. Corning's an example that many Americans are familiar with. And these are used in all of our cars, in our catalytic converters. So in cars, we need a high temperature material, a ceramic material that we then coat with precious metals that are used to clean up the exhaust in our exhaust gas. In this case, we don't need a high temperature ceramic and we don't need precious metals. We need a high surface area, low cost contactor that can operate at low temperatures where we're interested in working, that can be suitably coated with amines or other sorbent materials that can capture the CO2. So we're also coating these with MOFs and other projects, so there's a wide variety of materials that you can put on these types of contactors. The advantage of these is you get very, very low pressure drops, and with very, very low pressure drops on the order of 0.01 to 0.03 pounds per square inch, you can afford to move all of your gas only using fans. And by using fans, you have much lower electricity costs compared to if you were to do compression. So these monolith contactors allow us to get this low pressure drop, this item number 1 that's necessary for a practical process. Item number 2, I said, was an adsorbent with a strong binding energy, so with good thermodynamics, because we want to absorb a large amount of CO2 at low pressures of CO2. And if you look at what a typical isotherm would look like in the low pressure regime for a physisorbent, so a physisorbent, a typical physisorbent might be a zeolite 13X, low cost, readily available, low heat of absorption. And we've got an isotherm that's got a very shallow rise, I would say, at low pressures, and you get to very high capacities at high pressures of CO2. If you instead move to a material that's based on an oxide coated with, for example, a primary amine, we can be dealing with a much higher heat of adsorption. This gives us a stronger binding energy and can manifest itself in a steeper adsorption isotherm, whereby the capacity that one would achieve at high pressures associated with flue gas is not that different from the equilibrium capacity, at least, achieved at low pressures associated with 400 ppm CO2 in an inert gas like in ambient air. So we've done a wide variety of studies on different amine types. We've been able to show that primary amines are the most effective. They have the highest heat of adsorption, the steepest adsorption isotherm. And these amines are effective in all humidities. So we can do this in the desert, we can do this in the tropical rainforest. These amines work well and are not inhibited by humidity. So item 2, thermodynamics, I think we have that with supported amines. Item 3, kinetics, is really facilitated by the use of those monolith contactors. So you have a slow approach to equilibrium when you're dealing with a very dilute gas. And so if you were to simply pass CO2 containing or air containing CO2 over your sorbent in a typical lab scale conductor like a thermogravimetric analyzer with a slow flow rate, you can see your fractional uptake is plotted here as a function of time. If the fractional uptake of 1 means you've reached equilibrium, you can see you have a very long, slow approach to equilibrium associated with getting the last CO2 molecules to the last amine sites in these materials. So in a TGA, it would take us roughly a day in order to achieve capacity. However, if we go to a monolith contactor with practical conditions, with a gas velocity, linear velocity on the order of 2 to 5 meters per second, we can achieve a working capacity, what works out to be about 70% of the equilibrium capacity, in less than a half an hour. So we would never run all the way towards equilibrium. You take some shorter time period, cycle the system such that you have a working capacity that would be, in this case, on the order of about 70% of the equilibrium capacity while using a monolith contactor. So the monolith contactor has 2 important advantages. 1, it gives you low pressure drop, and 2, it facilitates rapid kinetics. So the fourth one is our regeneration, and this is where we have to put energy and money into the process in order to regenerate the adsorbent so that we can reuse it and to concentrate the CO2. We'd like to have a low-cost source of energy, and we like to use low-grade heat in the form of waste heat from industrial processes in the short term. In the long term, we're going to have to pay for this heat that we're going to get if we were to do this at a very large scale. But in the short term, we can partner with manufacturing processes, potentially use solar thermal heating as a way to give us the heat that we need in this low temperature regime, 80 to 100 degrees C. And we use that heat in the form of steam, whereby we can take an adsorbent that's in our monolith contactor that's got CO2 on it and bring in steam. The steam provides both a temperature and a concentration driving force for desorption, giving us a steam CO2 mixture that upon compression allows us to drop out the water and give us a highly purified CO2 gas stream that we can work with. So we like this steam stripping approach. We think it's very scalable. It's something you can do really in very large number of locations. And it's amenable to our amine monolith process approach. And the fifth one is the one that I don't have an answer for today because we're still working on it. And so what is, how much is are these sorbents going to cost us in the long term? Are the sorbents that we make and use going to last a year, 10 years, 100 years, a week? If it's a week, the answer is this approach won't work. If the answer is a year, it might work. Certainly if it's on the order of 5 years, this approach will be very, very effective. So we want to try to get acceptable capital costs and ultra-long process material lifetime. Capital costs, as they would be in post-combustion capture, are going to be significant, and the installations are going to be pretty big. If you want to think about the land area necessary to do this type of work with a global thermostat type of contactor, it's on the order of 0.01 meters squared per ton of CO2 per year. And the approach is to use these modular units, each of which, if I remember the numbers correctly, would produce on the order of 1,000 tons per year of purified CO2. To use these modular systems, they could be parallelized. And really at this point, we know how to do the capital cost calculations for the large equipment that's routinely done. It's been done by multiple organizations as well as by Global Thermostat. And we know what those costs are. The largest cost unknown is the lifetime of the adsorption media. So depending on the lifetime of that adsorption media that we're working on, that will be a significant player in our total costs. And because I receive research funding for Global Thermostat, because they've licensed intellectual property from me, I have to give this conflict of interest statement here on the bottom, according to my Georgia Tech lawyers, that says that if Global Thermostat makes $100 million, I will make 50 cents. I'm legally required to tell you that. So you heard from Global Thermostat on Monday, no doubt, and I'd happy to address any questions about their approach and my research later today. Got a few more slides that I want to go through, though. So coming back to this list that I gave you, I feel, as a scientist, very confident that we've got the first 4 of these well handled. And to me, the big question that ultimately leads to whether or not this type of process will be economical is item 5, and that's going to take us some time to develop the data to understand what our process lifetimes will be. I'm very, very optimistic about this, but I simply don't have enough data as a scientist to conclude one way or another at this point. So if I were to summarize what we've done with regard to air capture, supported amine adsorbents are promising materials for the extraction of CO2 from ambient air. I particularly like them because they're low temperature chemisorbents that are relatively low cost. This is the very definition of a commodity application if we were ever to do this. We're going to be doing this at a large scale. I'm talking about CO2 capture in general. And the design of exotic materials for such applications quite often will be too expensive. So we're trying to work with simple materials that we can use at scale quickly. The supported amines offer the advantage of high capacities, and we're typically looking at swing capacities on the order of 1 to 2 moles of CO2 per kilogram sorbent, depending on how we're optimizing the system. And we can operate in all humidity levels. Reasonable adsorption kinetics can be achieved with these monolith contactors, and those contactors are a very important component of our design. We think primary amines are the most exciting because they have the highest working capacities, and they're also the most resistant to oxidation. So the challenge associated with keeping these things operating for a year or 5 years is to have a sufficient process control such that you don't oxidize the amines to imines and amides which is where they want to go thermodynamically. And so you want to separate the times when these materials are at high temperature from the times when these materials are exposed to the 21% oxygen that exists in ambient air. And then finally, we want to work on optimizing the swing capacity and the sorbent lifetime, and that's what we continue to do as time marches forward. Okay, so that's all I have, and I'm around for the rest of the day, so I'm happy to address questions at the appropriate time.
So next speaker is Professor Berend Smit, and he's going to be talking about the computational side of how to select the better solvent for CO2 capture. And he's the director of the EFRC, Energy Frontier Research Center on CO2 capture.
So thanks. My presentation will be on what we do in Berkeley with this EFRC. And the EFRC is funded by Basic Energy Science, and the EFRC started with this report. And this report was a study made a few years ago on what are the new challenges for science. And in this particular case, they made the argument that a new set of materials for energy-related applications should be synthesized with the, not on an ad hoc fashion where you test things, but tailor-made towards a certain application. So the way we translated that in the Energy Frontier Research Center is, can we make a material for gas separation, say carbon capture, in which we try to put every single atom at exactly the right place to separate CO2. And we do that with support of computational and characterization methods. So a disclaimer of this presentation is that the aim of this work is to optimize scientific pleasure, in the sense that our program manager gets nervous if things are useful on a time scale within 15 years. So any useful outcome of this work should be seen as purely accidental. So one thing you will see here, the materials we are looking at, they are synthesized at the speed of a few grams per graduate student per day. So if you would like to scale these materials, they are now, the price would be probably for a capture plant more expensive, more money than is available in the world. But the aim is slightly different. What we like to do is we like to be able to make materials with exactly the right properties. So we're looking for a platform of materials that is highly tunable. And this is a very interesting one. These are metal organic frameworks. They have the world record in surface area. So you have here a metal, and you can make a linker with it, and you get a nanoporous materials where the pores can vary in many lengths. The interesting thing, what we'll actually see, you can change the metal, you can change the linker, so you have an enormous chemical tunability that you can try to take advantage of in tailor-making a material with exactly the right properties. So my own field is computational, so I will discuss a little bit more on the computational aspect. But here you sort of get the idea. So this is this simple MOF5 based material. For example, you can the chemical flexibilities, you can use these linkers. They all form the same crystal structures, but they have different functional groups. But you can also change the metal and change the pore topologies. So if you then do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, you can actually generate, with these type of ingredients, millions of different materials, and then the question is which one is the best for carbon capture. This is something which is actually related to a sort of a recent initiative which is called the materials genome. And you see it actually quite often, that with a materials genome, it's basically the idea is the analogy with biology, where DNA is coding for proteins. With a few simple ingredients, 20 different amino acids, you can make millions of different proteins. It's the same here. With a few simple ingredients, we can select many millions of materials or synthesize them. The synthesis of these materials is relatively easy. The difficulty is finding the right solvent mixture. So they typically have robots in Berkeley where they mix solvents, and it takes up to a few days to a few months to find the right solvent conditions to actually crystallize the material. So what you will see in practice, that in principle you can synthesize all possible materials, but in practice it won't be done. Only a small fraction of it. So there is room for computational techniques. So the first attempt we did on the computational, and that's more because we had something available than that is important from a practical point of view, and these are zeolites. Zeolites is also a material where with the chemical component, silicon oxides, you can make many different pore topologies. So here the chemical structure is always the same, but the pore topology varies. There are about 180 known zeolite structures, but there is a database with over 3 million hypothetical zeolite structures that look like zeolites. They're porous, but they haven't been synthesized yet. If you compare this with metal organic frameworks, there are over 5,000 to 10,000 new materials, different pore topologies, different structures with metal organic framework, and the number of possible materials is even larger. So you see this combinatorial approach to materials is really there. And the question we sort of posed, which one is the best for carbon capture? This is a description of this database. You have here density and the energy. Every point is a material. So what we did using computational techniques is we predicted the adsorption isotopes of CO2 and nitrogen of every single material. These are, from a computational point of view, it's not difficult to predict an adsorption isotope using the crystal structure of a zeolite with force fields for a material. The challenge was to do it for 100,000 materials efficiently. Well, this is something we can solve. So what we have then done is identify a metric to compare these materials, and this is with help with APRI. So what we do is, cost is not an issue here because you cannot synthesize the material anyway. So what we decided to look at is the parasitic energy. So if you have a carbon capture process, you can either do temperature swing or pressure swing. And the most important variable in there is the working capacity of the material. So we vary the working capacity of a material, and we optimize the working capacity such that the parasitic energy is minimized. And the parasitic energy is then defined as the loss of electricity given the carbon capture and compression process for geological storage. And what you then can do is you can just optimize the parasitic energy for a given material, and then we use the minimum parasitic energy for a given material as a metric to compare different materials. And what we see here, this is a function of the Henry coefficient. This is the parasitic energy, and every dot is a material. The red ones, the red ones are the known zeolite structures, and these other ones are the hypothetical zeolite structures. Now, what is the message we actually get? Well, of course, what you can do is you can identify the ones that are the lowest. This is a comparable calculation for amine technology, so it's slightly lower. But the interesting thing is, of course, to identify why this material is the lowest. Well, the message is actually very simple. In order to create a good material, a good adsorbent for CO2, you need adsorption sites. And the Henry coefficient is a measure of the strength of the adsorption. So if you have the Henry coefficient and you multiply it with pressure, you get loading. So if your Henry coefficient is very low, you hardly get any material, any CO2 adsorbed. So if you then do a temperature or pressure swing, you basically do a lot of work with hardly any CO2 being captured. The other extreme on this side is you have extremely strong binding sites. So it's very good in capturing, but it costs a lot of energy to regenerate. And in between, there is sort of this optimum, not too strong, not too weak. Then you actually see you have many materials that have the same Henry coefficient, the optimum Henry coefficient, but they're not optimum. And that is the other variable, is actually the number of adsorption sites. So what you see here, the one with the lowest parasitic energy is the material with the highest number of adsorption sites that have the optimum energy. So this is sort of a curve. What is then interesting to do is to compare that reference curve for all possible zeolites. So the idea is actually here, from all possible zeolites, this is probably the lowest you can get. Then we try to compare this result with the materials that have been synthesized actually in the laboratory. They include polymer porous networks, zeolites, ZIFs, and metal organic frameworks. And here are some of the classes. And this is actually quite an interesting curve. This is, again, the Henry coefficient. This dotted line is sort of this envelope we actually got from the zeolites by screening all zeolites. And all the dots are sort of materials we have synthesized. And you can actually see we get materials really to what we see as the lowest parasitic energy you can get with these materials. What initially surprised us is that we didn't get much lower with other materials, and the real reason for that is that within this calculation, the only real variable there is for the material, except for the Henry coefficient and the number of adsorption sites, is the specific heat of adsorption. The specific heat for how much energy you need to put in to increase the temperature. And for most solid materials, that's more or less the same. So what you actually see is whether you create an adsorption site using a metal organic framework or a zeolite or another material, if it has the right strength and if you have the right number of these sites, it doesn't really matter which material you use. You need to create that adsorption site. And then the other argument is a little bit, in order to create an adsorption site, you need stuff, you need materials, whether that is zeolite material or metal organic framework. The differences are not that big. So we more or less argue that this is probably as good as you can get. Well, I promised that this wouldn't be very useful. Well, that's correct, so don't worry, because we have optimized now a material for a flue gas that doesn't contain any water. And as soon as you add water, I will argue this is pretty useless. So I kept my promise. So, but what we can do is compare, was for a 15% CO2 concentration. We can also look at how this picture is changing if we go to more dilute streams. Then you can see here to natural gas, and you actually shift your optimum towards higher adsorption strengths. So you still need optimum adsorption site, but the lower the concentration, the higher the strength that is optimum. And you can actually see if you, in this calculation, we assumed, let's vent all the CO2 and capture it back again. So it's a way of putting a carbon capture plant next to a power plant, except for connecting them. You just then take it from the air. And then you actually see that the costs, in the very extreme case that you have very strong binding sites, they converge a bit. So this is actually quite a nice result, I think. Okay, so now some interesting science with this one. And this is on this one. And so this was our optimum material. And this is MOF 74. And I find it a fascinating material for many reasons. And the thing here, it's special because it has so-called open metal sites. And that makes the chemistry of these materials very different from what we have seen elsewhere. So what do? It's organometallic chemistry. So it's coordination chemistry. So they form this material. And in this particular case, you have the linkers that coordinate with the metal, but it's also a solvent molecule that coordinates. Then it crystallizes. And what you then can do is you can evaporate that solvent molecule, leaving an open metal site. And that open metal site is very interesting for catalysis and all kinds of chemical activity. But you have now a system, since the solvent has disappeared, where this open metal site is there in vacuum. And of course, it's very attractive for CO2, but probably more attractive for water. Well, why is this interesting? Because we were doing the simulations for zeolites. We took the potentials from the literature. We predicted the adsorption isotherms, and they really reproduced the experimental data. For this one, it was very different. So here you see the experimental data. And this was our estimate using the same force fields from the literature. So it was orders of magnitude off. And the reason is because those open metal sites have never been seen in solution, so none of the force fields take that into account. So what we then do is we develop techniques to be able to use quantum chemistry, get force fields, and with that you can actually see that because of the open metal sites, the CO2 molecule couldn't approach optimally with the old force field. So you had to reduce the diameters of the molecules a bit. If you do that, you actually get this result. And yeah, here are some sensitivities with the force fields. And what you can actually see that all the differences between the experimental data and our predictions is that the experimental data are wrong. So maybe a little bit of explanation. The issue here in making these materials is we assume infinitely large perfect crystals, and that is nearly impossible to synthesize. So the trick is with these open metal sites, you need to activate them all, and that is extremely difficult to do. But we know that for every open metal site, there is one CO2 molecule. Now, and that is something they can test experimentally. And what they found is that the 80% are activated. The other ones are blocked or still have solvent molecules. So if you multiply, if you correct this 80% and you make it 100%, you get the red line. So this is basically, it's nearly impossible to make perfect crystals with these materials. So that's why the issue is more experimental. You have to do this scaling. Okay? Yeah, the same thing here, it's more serious. This is water. We wanted to know what water going on. So here are the set of experimental data we have. So what we did is actually DFT calculations, try to develop the same force field. So this is again the old force field, and this is the force field we decided to use. So we get the steep part, we get the saturation much higher, but here we have no real good idea what the experimental data should be. So we just assume that we do reasonably well. So, and this was the old experimental data set. At least we have the step correct. So what we then do is we use these molecular simulations now to predict, actually, to look which metal is optimum for this carbon capture. So here you have the different open metal sites, and what we change is the metal. So you look at magnesium, zinc, and cobalt. And they have been synthesized, and this one, the magnesium one, looks optimum, but zinc is actually not that far away. And then the question was actually, if you have water, which one would be better? So here we have now the adsorption isotherms of magnesium and zinc. And it's interesting because what you see with the zinc one, you get a very extreme step. And this one is much more gradual. But you see the magnesium one is at much lower pressure. It saturates with water. And this one is at much higher one. So what we now can do in a simulation that's relatively simple, if you have a good force field for water, if you have a good force field for CO2, you can mix the two and calculate the mixture isotherms. And as far as I know, they have not been measured experimentally. So what we see here is that the magnesium one, you see at extremely low water concentration, it completely displaces the CO2. And this is even at, you cannot get a flue gas that dry. So from a practical point of view, even it would be optimum, drying would not really be an option because you will always have a mole fraction more than 10 to the minus 1 or something like that. But you see then here that the zinc, which wasn't that good for, without water, actually can sustain a little bit higher water concentration. Well, the other thing is very interesting is the mode of adsorption is very different because in the magnesium, the water is so strongly bound. In order to get more water in there, you really need to turn the water around that it forms a water bonded network within the pores if it saturates. And with zinc, the adsorption is less, so it immediately forms a hydrogen bond network in the pores, but at a much higher water pressure. Okay, the conclusions here. We find it actually very important if you do these large-scale screening that you have a sensible metric. So we use the parasitic energy as a metric, but there are many more. So from a scientific point of view, I'm actually quite excited from the idea that we now can use these materials to tailor-make a material that is really optimum for a very useless flue gas, but you can do the separation. And the other thing, there are many aspects with these metal-organic framework where from a computational point of view, we really don't understand the chemistry very well, and we had to do these fundamental studies, but also with characterization. Can you actually measure this change in the electronic structure if you absorb CO2 with all kinds of X-ray scattering techniques? All these kind of things have been developed. So the chemistry is interesting. A few things. This is just publicity. We just wrote a book on carbon capture and sequestration, which appeared. And the other thing is as one of them, I think Alissa will mention that again, but one of the outcomes of this network is that Alissa and I wrote a proposal for a series of Gordon conferences. And the first one will be May 31 to June 2015 in Stonehill College in Massachusetts. The way it works, these Gordon conferences, some Gordon conferences last for 60 years, and they then every other year. And the idea is you have a chair and vice chair, which in this particular case cannot be chosen by the community, but it's the people that wrote the proposal. But the idea is that we organize this Gordon conference, and then the next vice chair will be elected by the people. What is actually very important, in order to maintain these Gordon conferences, you have to have a community that supports it. So it's sort of, if we want to have these type of conference organized every other year, it's important that the community supports it and attends it, that we were a success. So you will get some emails from us asking to send this around to PhD students and those kind of things. What is actually very nice about these Gordon conferences is it's sustainable in a sense. Once it's a success, once it's clear that the community supports these type of conferences, we could organize them every other year with a rotating or a changing chairmanship in the area of this workshop. And these are people that contributed to this work and the acknowledgement of the sponsors.
So last speaker, but not the least, and is Professor Mogensen at Technical University of Denmark. And if you were here first day of our entire meeting, he started with really exciting conversation on CO2 air capture and conversion. So we'll wrap it up with your presentation again on what's happening CO2 conversion research R&D in Europe.
Thank you, Alissa, and thank you for letting me go on this panel. It will be a brief presentation because I was carefully instructed it should be not more than 10 minutes. So let's see. I think I have more time actually, so let me see. But I've prepared 10 minutes. Well, there are many different activities in Europe related to CO2 conversion. And that's what I was asked to talk about. In fact, it was not my own choice. I proposed something else, but that's fine to tell about Europe. So, but just to tell why and how this looked like this. All the kind of activities which are going on there are not going on only for doing the conversion. And here, when I talk about conversion, that's using renewable energy to convert CO2 to fuel or chemicals, but mainly fuel. And there are many activities right here in Europe, because we search for better electrolytes, we search for better electrocatalysts and electrodes and interconnect materials and cell stack components and so on and so on. And that's for other kind of fuel cells than solid oxide, which we are mainly dealing with and which I will touch upon. But also the electrocatalyst and catalyst for converting syngas or hydrogen plus CO2 because that can also be done, of course, and it is being done, in fact, now. So, and I'll end up with a few words about a demonstration project which is taking place, which has been published recently. Let me just go around some of the countries, because as you kind of understand, I hope that as it is such a bit, say, fluffy thing, because what's belong to what, it's in a situation where I, of course, cannot cover it all, because that would take the rest of the day at least. Now, Britain, there are some main players over there. University of St Andrews, Imperial College and Sheffield University has come in more recently. The two first ones have been in the business many years, and all three places do research in solid oxide electrolyzer cells, and including proton-conducting ceramic electrolytes. So there you have the principal possibility, especially if you go down in lower temperatures, say 400 degrees C, that you can, inside the cell, make the full reduction of CO2 to methane, for instance. In order to go to things like methanol, yeah, you have to go to even lower temperature. In Denmark, we have, as you heard Monday already, we have a lot of activities. Haldor Topsøe is and Topsøe Fuel Cell is the daughter company of Haldor Topsøe. And so they have a lot of activity, as John Bugel told. More than 100 people are working on the solid oxide cells. And there's, I think, I read 40 kilowatt, but I think John said 50 kilowatt power to fuel demonstration project running in Denmark. I don't know any details of this, because I don't think we have seen what is being built up and coming out yet, but that will come. We also in Denmark, in our group, in fact, do advanced alkaline electrolysis, something at 250 degrees C, 40 bars, and then you can do they're much more efficient than in the conventional old-fashioned alkaline one, because you have, first of all, pressurized hydrogen coming out, which is efficient for further processing, but also we can come up with about 5 times higher kinetics, 5 times higher current density than in alkaline classical type. And then also in Denmark there is, and also in DTU, but also at a small company called IRD, and in Aalborg University there's PEM, electrolysis cells. France is having some activities on alkaline cell and CEA, and I think there are several of the universities also doing now and then in various projects. Methanation of CO2 is something CEA deals with. Norway, they do materials in the two universities, technical, more or less technical universities they have. They do materials research mainly. Germany, a lot of activities. We had a presentation Monday by Christian von Olshausen and Sunfire, so I'm not going to touch more on this, but for electrolysis, there's EIFA, a European Institute for Energy Research, and there's Forschungszentrum Jülich, there's Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, KIT, Frauen Institute of Ceramic Technology, IKTS in Dresden, and they're all doing solid oxide cells and more solid oxide electrolyzer cells for CO2 and for steam electrolysis and co-electrolysis. And also in Germany there is this demo of power to gas by Audi, where they now very recently have taken into the project also air capture, or CO2 captured from air. And then a final thing, all the catalytic conversion of CO2 using, because that's what Audi is using, let me say that, they're using hydrogen made by electrolysis conventionally alkaline electrolysis. And then, of course, you need to have good catalyst to change hydrogen and CO2 or CO, because you can, of course, do this CO2, hydrogen gas, water gas shift, and then you can do the very conventional catalytic conversion of little CO2 in CO to methanol. So there's all this kind of research, but that's mainly done for other purposes than just renewable energy to fuel. Of course, more and more comes up that now, at least argued by power to gas or power to fuel. And it covers everything from DFT calculations to development of commercial products. And of course, first of all, I'm not able to give a full overview of this because it's a very broad area, and then certainly it's not really the topic to come up with here. But just I think it is worth mentioning that all sorts of kind of other activities are important to our field. Electrolysis is the way to basically, in our opinion, to at least in the shorter term, to convert CO2 into fuel. And the alkaline commercial one, which has been commercial available electrolyzer system for close to 100 years now, at least more than 80, and it has not been developed so much, surprisingly, and it's not so efficient. You see, in order to have something which is really efficient, you should not go over a cell voltage than 1.5 and have, of course, a high current density to have some efficiency. And you see here that even though there's a broad span, in order to come down to 1.5 volt, which is for efficient reasons the goal, you come to something like 0.2 amp per square centimeter. The advanced alkaline ones, and also PEM is too expensive. That's the problem. PEM would be good if you could make it with cheap material, but that's very much filled up with noble metals, and you have very, very strong requirements. So it's something like titanium alloys and so on you're using for the support. So that becomes very expensive, but otherwise it's not too bad with respect to efficiency. And in fact, advanced alkaline I was talking about, which is early stage of R&D. I think in fact now this is a couple of years back. We can come we come down to here, so we can expand this blue one down to here now. And I think also other people have done on the PEM, so this comes down here. Whereas so far I'm not really aware of anybody doing research which push this with the old system. You have to probably do other systems than this one. It's a long story, of course, how are all the technical details on the commercial classical alkaline one, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact or the way they have designed it with separators and so on, and it's all immersed into water, or not water, alkaline electrolyte, but it's aqueous. So it's difficult to change too much, so you have to go to a different system. Now, solid oxide is much more efficient than you see here. Really, you can, in all this range here, you can do higher than, if you have heat available, you can do higher than 100% electrical efficiency, much higher. The 100% electrical efficiency is for steam electrolysis 1.9, and for if it's water or CO2, that's about the same, meaning that we start with liquid water, then it is about 1.5. But if you have the heat available from sun, for instance, or in the near future from for combining with power plants where you have surplus heat, yeah, then you can come down here and you can go to 120% electrical efficiency. And power plants, of course, it should not be fossil fuel, but it could be biofuels. So there you can combine things. And even if you, yeah, especially if you go up to the higher current densities, you can still have very, very high efficiencies. And you see it's quite high current densities, which has been reported, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Here, not a minute, a second. And it's a pretty old graph, which I'm usually presenting when I talk about these things, because we deliberately those days, back in 2006, probably 2007, tried to see how far can we push it, and took the temperature high up, 950 degrees C, and you see we can come up to almost 4 amps per square centimeter at 1.5 volt. So this is really something, and you can make very, very good economy out of this if you could run up here all the time. But we realized that there was a durability problem, and in fact, that's, yeah, let me come back to that in a minute. That's the main thing to develop is durability, and we have done so, of course. Not that we can run 4 amps per square centimeter yet, but we can make something which is reasonable. Also, before I go, note that this is really reversible. You see, you go from the solid oxide here with what we call negative current densities when you have to supply them, and into fuel cell, solid oxide fuel cell here. It's just going straight lines over the zero current density. So they are fully reversible. And that's also was discussed Monday, that it's important because then you have to the possibility to use these devices for both electricity production and fuel conversion and CO2 to fuel electricity consumption, and in this way make a much more efficient turnaround for the intermittent renewable energy sources. Otherwise, if it's an electrolyzer which can only run one way, namely electrolysis, and then you have to wait to have the surplus electricity, so to say, from the renewable during either daytime for midday time for solar cells, or wind will often be during night times and times where you don't need it, at least all of it. So that's important for the economy. We, back in time, 7-8 years ago, we really had, as I mentioned, problems with the durability because we saw that the durability was less for the electrolyzer mode compared to the fuel cell mode, and it has to do with the fact that you have the water gradients in the fuel electrode. It goes outwards, high concentration inside the electrode with the electrolyte, and then lower and lower out when you run it as fuel cells. And impurities have to follow the water. If it goes with the water, it's carried with the water. So that's not so sensitive to impurities as in the electrolyzer cell, where you have the opposite, and you take the water away in, and the impurity will come to precipitate. So we had to figure out how to clean our stuff very carefully and in a cheap manner, and we did. But also it's important how good the electrodes are, because overvoltage, too high overvoltage, just one of the electrodes tend to destroy them. And here we have, as good as it's not it's being published, but not, it's sorry. Yeah, it's in preparation. But have a look here, 2,500 hours, so it's a reasonably long time. And here we have some degradation. We know that's of the fuel electrode, the first couple of 100 hours, and then it becomes stable. So this is not so important when you look at the time span, and you have to run it at least some 10,000 hours, 20,000 maybe, more than a year. 2-3 years we think should be at least the durability for such kind of stuff. And you see it's pretty stable. It's about 1% per kilo hour, and that should be for 1,000 hours. That should be about okay. And there is a funny thing here where you had a gas supply failure, so we were forced. Otherwise, we just run them with constant current galvanostatically, but we were forced to let it rest, so to say. And you see, when it's resting for a while, it becomes better. You see now the over voltage, the total voltage to drive the 1 amp per square centimeter becomes significantly less. It comes back again and slightly higher than before, but then stabilizes. So, in fact, this is also seen, and that's another thing is under publication. I didn't take it in here because of the time limitations I should have done, but anyway, I can tell you that if you do it reversible, so you go not only let it just rest, but go to the fuel cell mode, it's even more activated and becomes better. And in fact, running it forth and back is much, much more efficient, much better than just running in one direction. And again, back to the reversible application, this is important because that's important for economy. We also looked many years ago back in say, cost estimation, just to get, we don't claim that we can calculate this in a way that we know what it will cost exactly in the future, but some kind of, and it's given here are all the assumptions and so on, how we did it. But one important finding was that we have here cost of electricity, US cent per kilowatt hour, and then we have just on a simple energy basis say, okay, we turn it into something, so it's kilojoule to kilojoule, we turn it into equivalent price of hydrogen in terms of barrel, dollar per barrel of crude oil. And when we do this, you can see here that in a case like Iceland, where we take the very cheapest electricity we can imagine, we see already at such a point of electricity price, we are up having roughly two-thirds of the price is the electricity. And then the investment cost is the 30%, and of course it will help to get it down further, but yeah, and that's how it is, and then the rest is very tiny stuff. And depending on, of course, what is the cost, you have this coming up if you go to this one here. But I think this, according to the DOE calculations, which John talked about, we are in the right ballpark. I think, in fact, they are slightly lower. But that's again, of course, there's uncertainty also on their numbers. So it shows up that if you say what is it more realistic, the renewable energy may be up in this regime here, but still you can get your hydrogen for something like $60 per barrel equivalent. Now, the CO, which we can produce the same way, will cost about the same. And then, of course, you have to turn it into fuel and you have to handle it and so on. So maybe 2-3 times higher. I don't know, but you see, it does not come much above the maximum price we have had already. Once, what is it, $140 per barrel. And that's maybe where we 150, 160, with what it looks as if you can do it. Of course, you have to have mass production of these cells and stacks before you can this. But it seems to be that this is not so impossible to do this. At least worth working on, and a lot of people do, more and more people do. And even with less efficient electrolysis technology, Audi has decided to do a demonstration of methane production, substitute natural gas, synthetic natural gas, SNG, whatever you call it, and that's in order to have a demonstration that they can make renewable energy, the compressed natural gas, which they really go for in some of their cars. And So they have already built, I think they call it a plant. I guess it's kind of a pilot plant, but anyway, it's they call it a plant, and it's I think it's 2.5, 2,800 ton of CO2 they are going to convert. So I will call it a pilot plant, and it's in the commissioning phase, so they have kind of built it. And now recently they had a press release telling that they have now made a deal with alliance with Climework, which is a Swiss, small Swiss startup company doing air capture. In fact, it's such a immobilized amine type as which we heard about earlier today. They have, with the first device they are building, the goal of having 1,000 ton per year, so it's smaller, but I think they will now scale it up faster than this. And Audi is for sure that, they're claiming for sure that this can be made, maybe not commercially in this here, but they both parties are in fact sure that this can be a business in a not too far future. So I think they are really very determined that, to show that this can be done and you can get something out of air capture commercially in the near future. And that's really exciting to see. And I just want to add that if this can be done using the old-fashioned alkaline electrolyzer, then in a few years when Topsy and several other companies, probably also around the world, have developed solid oxide fuels, solid oxide electrolyzer stacks, that will be several times cheaper to produce the hydrogen. So with this, here, and a picture of the Climework, just to show they have a device made, they can do it. It's not something which on the paper. It's the first prototype, and I have this is from the internet, but I haven't seen it myself because we have formal cooperation with them. And Søren Ebberhøj, who talked Monday, his PhD is financed by a project in cooperation with them, so it can be done.